The hospital was filled with murmurs. It seemed like just another day of scheduled surgeries, a day that promised routine. But in medicine, routine is nothing more than an illusion. All it takes is a single second for everything to change. Inside operating room number 3, Dr. Gregg, a surgeon of recognized experience, was about to begin a complex procedure. He was one of those doctors who appeared unshakable under the bright surgical lights, steady, confident, accustomed to facing the unpredictable with a cold, precise hand. By his side, as always, was the anesthesiologist, Boyd, a meticulous man, silent, respected by everyone. He was the invisible guardian of every surgery, the one who kept the patient stable while the scalpel did its work. But that day, the guardian would fall. The surgery began without complications. The patient was deeply asleep, breathing in sync with the anesthesia machine. The room was flooded with white surgical light, an almost artificial brightness that left no room for shadows. Only 2 sounds filled the air: the steady beep of the monitors like a metronome of life, and the metallic clink of instruments being laid out by the nurses with ritual precision. Gregg held the scalpel with the confidence of someone who had performed that gesture thousands of times. The first incision was clean, steady. The air carried the sharp metallic scent of blood mixed with disinfectant. It was the beginning of what should have been a calm, predictable operation, but something broke that illusion. Gregg noticed it from the corner of his eye. Boyd, seated next to the anesthesia machine, looked wrong. His skin, usually pink and healthy, had turned grayish. His lips had lost their color. His breathing was shallow, rapid, as if each breath was a battle. And his hands, those steady hands that had guided countless needles and medications, trembled faintly over his lap. At first, no one said anything. Everyone saw it but brushed it off as fatigue. After all, who wasn't exhausted? In that hospital, endless shifts left their marks on every face, every gesture. Maybe it was just accumulated tiredness. Until it happened. Boyd clutched his chest suddenly, violently, as though something inside him had torn apart. His eyes widened in shock and pain, and in a single eternal second, his body collapsed. The sound of his fall echoed louder than any alarm. The operating room froze. The monitors of the patient on the table continued their steady rhythm, calm, indifferent to the disaster unfolding nearby. But now there was another heart in crisis, the heart of the man whose sole duty was to guard all the others. Boyd was suffering a massive heart attack right there in the middle of surgery. Time stopped. The nurses exchanged panicked glances, unsure where to run. The air grew thick with tension. Who should they save first? The patient, lying open on the table, or the anesthesiologist, now collapsing on the floor? Gregg acted before panic consumed them all. "Call cardiology now! Get me a defibrillator!" His voice cut through the paralysis like a blade. With a quick gesture, he delegated the patient's monitoring to a resident. He knew the exposed heart on the table couldn't wait, but neither could the one failing on the floor. And so, the surgeon who had saved countless lives in that very room now found himself kneeling beside his own colleague, facing an emergency he had never imagined, saving the anesthesiologist while still operating on his patient. Less than a minute later, the doors swung open violently. Dr. Robert entered, the on-call cardiologist. Tall, commanding, a man whose presence alone seemed to anchor the chaos. With a single glance, he grasped the gravity of the scene. The monitors showed only chaos, a deadly arrhythmia. If they didn't act immediately, Boyd wouldn't survive. Start compressions. Charge the defibrillator to 200. Robert's voice allowed no hesitation. Gregg moved beside him instantly. Rivalries, differences, everything vanished. Surgeon and cardiologist, shoulder to shoulder, now fought for the life of the man who, just minutes earlier, had been the quiet protector of every patient they operated on. The operating room was no longer a place of sterile precision. It had become a battlefield, and in the middle of it, on the cold floor, a desperate fight against death was raging. Chest compressions struck Boyd's ribcage with a dull, rhythmic thud, each one a desperate plea for his heart to keep beating. The monitor drew chaotic scribbles instead of rhythm. And above it all, the electric whine of the defibrillator filled the room, buzzing like the sound of fate charging up. "Clear!" Robert shouted. Boyd's body arched violently under the shock, as though lightning itself had torn through him, striking every cell from the inside out. Then he collapsed back against the floor, too still, too heavy, too limp. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the ragged breathing of those fighting for him. A nurse's voice trembled, betraying the fear she tried to mask with professionalism. "No pulse. Still in fibrillation." The words fell like a hammer in the room. Greg felt his throat close. He had witnessed countless patients slip away on these same tiles, had pronounced deaths, had stood over still bodies and walked away with the heavy acceptance of failure. But this wasn't the same. This was different. This was Boyd, his partner in every operation. The quiet anchor who had always been there, steady and unseen. The voice in the background whispering the words every surgeon needs to hear. The patient is stable. And now that voice, the guardian who had made every cut possible, was silent, broken, lying on the floor. Seconds dragged on like entire lifetimes. Sweat trickled down foreheads. Gloves grew damp. The rhythm of compressions thudded against Boyd's chest, each one more desperate than the last, as though sheer will could force his heart to remember how to beat. "Charge again!" Robert barked. The defibrillator whined, that electric buzz filling the air like the rising scream of fate itself. "Clear!" Another shock jolted through Boyd's frame. His body convulsed and dropped. The monitor answered only with chaos, lines spiking and dipping like a storm without direction. The room grew heavier, the kind of silence that wasn't absence of sound, but the crushing weight of fear. Nurses clenched their jaws, eyes wide, hands trembling at their sides as they prayed that this wouldn't be the end. Greg's chest ached as though he were the one receiving the shocks. He pressed his fist against the floor, steadying himself, refusing to let despair take hold. He couldn't lose him. Not Boyd. Not the man who had carried every surgery beside him in quiet strength. "Again," Robert demanded, unshakable, hands pressed. Chest rose and fell. Another shock. Another plea. The monitor spit back more static, refusing to give order to the chaos. And then it happened. The sound. A piercing, steady beep. It sliced through the despair like a blade of light through darkness. The jagged scribbles on the monitor straightened, forming a fragile, trembling rhythm. Weak, unstable. But there. Boyd's heart was beating again. The entire room seemed to exhale at once. Shoulders dropped, knees buckled. Some nurses sank into chairs as if their bodies had just remembered gravity. A few wiped at tears they hadn't realized were streaming down their cheeks. The tension that had gripped them all shattered, like glass breaking under pressure. Boyd's eyelids fluttered. At first, just a twitch, then a slow, hesitant opening. His gaze was hazy, his skin pale, lips nearly colorless. He tried to focus, tried to speak. His chest trembled with the effort. And in the faintest thread of a voice, he managed the only words that mattered to him. The patient. "Is he okay?" Greg's breath caught. He couldn't form words. His throat was tight, his heart pounding with relief and grief all at once. He simply nodded, unable to say anything, but his eyes said it all, because in that instant, Greg understood something he had always known but never felt so clearly. What it truly means to be a doctor. Not the title, not the scalpel, not the hours spent under the sterile lights, but this, risking everything, your strength, your calm, even your own life, for the sake of another. The surgery continued. But the silence that settled over the room was not the usual silence of concentration. It was heavy, reverent, burdened by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything. Every hand moved cautiously. Every instruction was followed with absolute precision. The resident at the anesthesia machine monitored every breath, every parameter as if her own life depended on it. Greg's voice cut through the weight, steady and commanding, pulling the team back into rhythm, reminding them they still had another life to finish saving. Minutes passed. The monitors steadied, the patient's vitals held, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last suture was tied. The wound was closed, the patient survived, Boyd was rushed to intensive care. His body was weak, but he was alive. Against all odds, he had survived a heart attack in the very place where he had kept so many others alive. For everyone present, it was more than a medical event. It was a brutal reminder of fragility, that even the guardians can fall. Days later, Greg entered Boyd's room. He found him thinner, paler, but with that same calm gaze. Boyd reached out a hand. Greg took it, and after a moment of silence, whispered, "That day we had 2 patients at once, one on the table and one on the floor, and both survived." Boyd's eyes welled with tears. He smiled weakly, moved beyond words, because in that moment, he realized he had been saved in the one place where he had always believed he was in control, the operating room. That day left an invisible scar on everyone who was there, a scar that spoke of truth. Medicine is not just technique or numbers. It is humanity. It is holding another life in your hands at their most fragile moment. 2 hearts stood on the edge of the abyss that day, and both kept beating because a team refused to give up. It was the most chaotic day they had ever lived, but also the one that reminded them of a truth no one can ignore. Doctors are human too. Even heroes can fall. And sometimes life comes back exactly when it seems gone forever. This story is proof. Inside a hospital, there are no ordinary days. Everything can change in an instant. And sometimes, even those who save lives need to be saved themselves. What would you have done, standing in Greg's place, faced with 2 patients at once? Leave it in the comments. I want to read your thoughts. Maybe the next story I tell will be yours. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming. Because here, every story reminds us, life and death walk closer than we think.